Imagine waking up at dawn to the sound of snapping twigs. Not an alarm clock, but the warning of a predator stalking your camp. Your body aches from sleeping on cold ground. Your hands are raw from hours of gathering plants that might be safe to eat, and your stomach growls because yesterday's hunt failed. Now imagine doing this every single day of your life. No weekends, no comfort. And if you're a cave woman, the stakes are even higher, because survival isn't just about you, it's about keeping an entire group alive. So what did cave women really do all day? And why was it far more brutal than we imagine? The first thing a cave woman felt each morning wasn't the warmth of sunlight. It was the sharp bite of cold air seeping through the cave entrance or the crude shelter she and her group had built. There was no such thing as sleeping in. The day started as soon as the sun hinted at the horizon, because daylight was survival time. Every minute of light mattered. Before anything else, she would scan her surroundings, eyes adjusted to the dim gray of early morning ears, tuned for the crunch of leaves or the snap of a branch. Predators liked the quiet hours before sunrise, and it was the woman's job, just as much as the men's, to ensure the camp was secure. That might mean checking the perimeter for signs of wolves, bears, or big cats, or confirming the fire hadn't died overnight, because without it, they'd be defenseless. If she had young children, they were never far from her side. Infants had to be kept warm and quiet, both for their survival and to avoid drawing unwanted attention. This often meant wrapping them in animal skins, tucking them close to her body, and feeding them before any other task could begin. Once immediate safety was confirmed, the real work began. A small group might head out to fetch water from a nearby stream, simple in theory, exhausting in practice. Without buckets, they used leather pouches or carved wooden bowls, often making multiple trips before breakfast. Others would start preparing for the day's food gathering, checking their stone tools for sharpness or repairing woven carrying baskets with sinew or plant fibers. It's tempting to imagine the early morning as calm and quiet, but the truth is it was filled with a constant, low-level urgency. Every action was tied to survival. There was no mental space for idle thoughts. The to-do list was dictated by nature itself. Protect the group, find food, and keep moving. And all of this started before the first proper meal of the day. After the initial burst of morning tasks, the next priority was preparing for the day's journey, because, in the Stone Age, work usually meant leaving camp. Cave women didn't just sit and wait for food to appear. They had to walk miles to gather edible plants, fruits, and roots. But before setting out, they needed energy. Breakfast wasn't a leisurely affair, it was whatever was left from the previous day. Sometimes this meant small chunks of dried meat, roasted tubers, or berries stored in woven pouches. If supplies had run low, breakfast might be skipped entirely, which made the day's work even more grueling. Imagine setting off on a 5-mile trek on an empty stomach, knowing that if you came back empty-handed, everyone, children included, would go hungry. The morning air was often damp and chilly, seeping into muscles and bones that already ached. From yesterday's labor, footwear, if any, was primitive animal hide wrapped around feet and tied with leather strips, barely enough to protect from sharp rocks or thorns. Every step was an exercise in both endurance and caution. Before leaving, the women would check the tools they needed: sharp-edged stones for cutting, digging sticks for prying roots from the ground, and nets or woven bags for carrying the haul back. These weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. A broken digging stick, could mean hours of wasted effort. Children who were too young to help were often carried on their mother's back or hip. Older children might be tasked with simple jobs carrying lighter loads, watching for dangerous plants, or keeping an eye out for movement in the bushes. This wasn't just training for was survival itself. The departure from camp wasn't casual. It was calculated. Women remembered where certain plants grew, where water sources were reliable, and where predators had been spotted recently. Each decision was a balance between efficiency and safety. One wrong turn could lead to wasted daylight or worse, a deadly encounter by mid-morning. The cavewoman's body was already warm from exertion, her senses heightened by constant scanning of her surroundings. The day was only beginning, but fatigue was already setting in as the sun climbed higher. The real challenge began not because the work got easier, but because it didn't stop. Every task in the Stone Age was physical, and there were no shortcuts. Even a simple job like gathering firewood meant bending, hauling, and carrying heavy loads back to camp over uneven ground. Cavewomen weren't just thinking about today. They were planning for the days ahead. A single trip to gather food or resources had to be maximized. If they found edible plants, they also scanned for medicinal herbs. If they gathered wood, they might also look for good quality stones to be shaped into tools later. The mind was always multitasking, even if the body was already pushed to its limit. The social dynamic of the morning was equally important. While some women worked in pairs or small groups for safety, others stayed closer to camp to tend to children, repair clothing, or process yesterday's catch. Cooperation wasn't optional, it was the glue holding the group together. A woman's survival depended as much on her own skill as on her ability to support and be supported by others. By late morning, the pace didn't slow, shifted. The gathering parties were now farther from camp, scanning the terrain for landmarks so they wouldn't lose their way back. Every sound was evaluated. Was that rustling a rabbit they could catch, or the approach of a predator? Even the wind. Direction mattered. It could carry their scent to an animal long before they saw it. Back at camp, women might be preparing hides, scraping them clean for clothing or shelter. The smell of smoke and drying meat hung in the air, a sign that life was holding steady, at least for now. But everyone knew that stability was fragile. A sudden change in weather, a predator sighting, or an injury could erase all their hard work in an instant. In the Stone Age, there was no such thing as settling in for the day. The morning's work was only the prelude. The real test, surviving the afternoon, was still ahead. Gathering might sound simple to modern ears, just picking berries and roots, right? But in the Stone Age, it was a full-scale survival mission, equal in importance to hunting. For cavewomen, gathering wasn't just about finding something to eat. It was about finding the right things, in the right season, and bringing them back before daylight ran out. The first step was knowledge passed down from older generations and tested every day in the field. A bright red berry could be a sweet source of sugar, or a poison that would kill within hours. Roots had to be dug carefully, since some edible plants looked almost identical to toxic ones. This was survival botany at its most urgent one. Mistake could cost not just the gatherer's life, but the lives of her children, her partner, or her entire group. Seasonality dictated everything. Certain plants only appeared for a short window each year, meaning that when they were available, gathering became an all-day priority. A failure to stockpile could mean months of hunger ahead. If the women knew a certain valley or riverside had high-yield food, they'd plan the journey like a mini expedition. sometimes walking several miles before the first basket was even half full, and the baskets themselves, woven from grasses, reeds, or animal sinew, were deceptively heavy once filled, carrying several pounds of roots or nuts back over uneven terrain required a mix of strength, balance, and sheer willpower. Many women wore deep grooves into their shoulders from the straps of their carrying bags. There was also constant competition, not just with rival human groups, but with animals. Birds, monkeys, and even small rodents could strip a berry bush clean overnight. The cave women who gathered early and quickly had the best chance of securing enough food for everyone. By mid-morning, the day's rhythm was set. Scan, pick, dig, carry, repeat. But in this repetition lay danger, because sometimes, to feed the tribe, you had to take risks that could cost you everything. Trial and error was not a choice. It was the only way humans learned what was safe to eat. For cavewomen, that meant living in a constant state of calculated risk. Sometimes, knowledge was passed down clearly. A grandmother warning, "Never eat the leaves of this plant," or pointing out the telltale markings of a poisonous mushroom. But not all dangers were known. When the group ventured into new territory or after a bad harvest, they often encountered plants no one had tried before. In those moments, someone had to decide whether to test it. Testing was a slow, nerve-wracking process. First, a woman might rub the plant's juice on her skin, waiting hours to see if irritation appeared. If safe, the next step was touching it to the lips, then chewing and spitting it out, and finally swallowing a tiny amount, then waiting again, sometimes all night, to see if sickness came. The stakes: anything from mild stomach pain to paralysis or death. Mushrooms were among the most dangerous. Many edible species had deadly lookalikes, and the difference could be a faint color variation or a subtle smell. Some toxins worked fast. Others took days, making it harder to connect the cause and effect. Cavewomen had to be both botanists and detectives. Beyond plants, there were other hazards. Certain edible nuts had to be leached of toxins in water for hours before they were safe to eat. Some tubers required roasting to destroy natural poisons. Forget one step, and the entire food supply could become lethal. Even safe food carried risks. Sharp thorns from berry bushes could pierce skin and cause infections. Uneven ground and thick vegetation made falls and twisted ankles common, an injury that could cripple a gatherer and jeopardize the whole tribe's survival. Gathering wasn't a peaceful stroll through nature, it was a daily gamble with life itself. And yet, without it, the tribe would starve. This meant that every woman, no matter how tired or sore, shouldered the risk again the next day. By midday, the baskets were heavy and the sun was unforgiving. The walk back to camp was often more punishing than the gathering itself. The women carried loads that could weigh anywhere from 15 to 40 pounds, bundles of roots, nuts, berries, and sometimes bundles of firewood if they spotted good timber along the way. These weren't carried in comfortable backpacks. Most were slung over the shoulders with leather straps or balanced on the head, requiring constant adjustments to avoid strain. Every step jarred sore muscles, and every climb up a slope felt like hauling an anchor. The physical toll was relentless. Hands were scraped and dirt-caked from digging, nails cracked, skin sunburned and weathered. Feet already barely protected were blistered and bruised, and yet complaining wasn't an option. Everyone in the group knew that if one person failed to carry their load, the entire tribe would feel the loss. There was also no guarantee the return trip would be safe. The smell of fresh berries or the rustle of a basket full of nuts could attract hungry animals. Predators weren't the only constant thieves from rival groups could be lurking, ready to take the food by force. Cavewomen traveled alert, scanning the terrain, ready to drop their baskets and run if necessary. Arriving back at camp was only half the work. The food had to be processed immediately, roots peeled, berries sorted, nuts cracked and stored. There was no refrigeration, so preservation methods were critical. This might mean smoking certain plants over a fire, drying them in the sun, or burying them in cool earth to keep them from spoiling. Even then, a portion of the whole was eaten right away. Children who had been hungry all day finally had something to chew, while the adults took stock of the supplies and decided how long they might last. For the cavewoman, there was no rest after the return. The gathering grind fed the tribe, but it also chained her to an endless cycle, because tomorrow she would have to do it all over again. The image of the cavewoman as a passive figure, waiting for men to return from the hunt, is a modern myth. In reality, her role was as vital, varied, and intellectually demanding as any hunter's. Gathering was just one part of her workload. The rest required an impressive range of skills that blurred the line between survival and craftsmanship. One of her most important roles was toolmaking and maintenance. While stone knapping, the process of chipping flint into sharp edges, was often a shared task between men and women. Many women became experts in shaping small, precise tools for food preparation, hide scraping, and plant processing. These tools weren't mass-produced. Each was custom-made for its purpose, requiring an understanding of angles, pressure, and the right type of stone. Textile work, in its earliest form, also fell largely to women. Using plant fibers, sinew, or strips of hide, they wove nets for trapping fish, cords for tying shelters, and baskets for carrying goods. A well-made net could mean the difference between catching food and going hungry. These skills required patience and an almost instinctive sense of engineering, as knots had to be both strong and flexible. Then there was hide processing, a messy, labor-intensive task that turned animal skins into usable clothing, blankets, or shelter coverings. Fresh hides were soaked, scraped of fat and tissue, and sometimes treated with smoke or animal brains to make them soft and durable. The smell was strong, the work exhausting, but the result could protect the group from deadly cold. None of this happened in a vacuum. These skills were taught, practiced, and refined through generations, with each woman adding her own innovations. A slightly different weave pattern might make a stronger basket. A new scraping technique could save hours of work. In the Stone Age, survival wasn't just about strength, it was about problem solving under pressure. And when resources were scarce, these skills became the tribe's lifeline. A well-preserved hide could mean warmth in winter. A sturdy net could mean food in the lean season. A sharp, well-made blade could mean life or death. In a world without refrigerators, granaries, or grocery stores, food preservation wasn't a luxury, it was a matter of life and death. Cavewomen mastered techniques to make the most of every hard-won calorie, stretching the bounty of a single day's work into sustenance for weeks or even months. Smoking was one of the most effective preservation methods. Meat, fish, and even certain plants could be hung over a slow-burning fire, absorbing the smoke that acted as a natural preservative. This process was time-consuming and required constant monitoring to prevent the food from burning or spoiling. But the payoff was huge. Smoked meat could last far longer than fresh, giving the tribe a cushion against future scarcity. Drying was another essential skill. Women spread sliced roots, berries, or thin strips of meat on flat stones or woven mats, leaving them under the sun's heat for hours or days. The key was positioning. Too much sun could scorch the food, too little could leave it vulnerable. To mold, it took a practiced eye to judge the right timing. Even underground storage was an art. Some foods could be buried in cool, shaded pits to keep them from rotting. Women knew where to dig to find soil that was damp but not wet, cool but not freezing, knowledge gained through years of trial, error, and observation. Preservation wasn't just about storing food, it was about managing it. Cave women had to track what was eaten first, what could be kept for later, and how to ration supplies without causing unrest in the group. This required foresight and diplomacy. A leader who mismanaged resources risked weakening the entire tribe. In many ways, these preservation techniques were the Stone Age version of long-term planning. They turned fleeting abundance into security, transforming today's hunt or gathering into tomorrow's survival. And while the men's successful hunt might grab the attention of a campfire story, it was the quiet, steady work of these women. Smoke, fires, turning meat, checking drying racks, that kept people alive during the long, hungry months. Survival in the Stone Age wasn't just about strength, it was about adaptability. Cave women faced a constantly shifting landscape of threats and shortages, and the difference between life and death often came down to quick thinking and creative problem solving. When a tool broke far from camp, there was no backup supply. Women learned to improvise on the spot, replacing a broken basket strap with twisted plant fibers, or reshaping a dull cutting stone with a few sharp strikes against another rock. They were masters of making something out of nothing, because nothing was truly trash in their world. Every scrap of hide, bone, and plant fiber could be repurposed. Even shelter maintenance demanded ingenuity. If strong winds tore apart a thatched covering, women patched it using woven reeds, layered bark, or overlapping hide, each layer adding insulation and protection against rain. Some groups experimented with mud plastering, learning that coating walls in clay could make them sturdier and more weatherproof. Fire, too, was an arena of constant innovation. Beyond simply keeping it burning, women learned to adjust heat levels for different needs. High heat for cooking tough roots, low embers for slow-drying meat, or smoky fires for deterring insects. When dry fuel was scarce, they sometimes used animal dung, an unappealing but effective alternative. Social problem-solving was just as critical. Disputes over resources could fracture a group, so experienced women often stepped in as mediators, finding ways to distribute goods fairly while keeping morale high. They knew that unity was as vital as food or fire, because a divided tribe was a doomed one. Perhaps most impressively, cave women passed these survival hacks down through demonstration and storytelling. A trick for weaving a stronger net, a shortcut for tanning hides, a way to predict weather from the smell of the air. These weren't written in books, but they were etched into the group's memory, ensuring that each generation started with a better toolkit than the last. In every adaptation, every small improvement, you can see the truth. Cave women weren't just surviving the Stone Age, they were engineering it. In the Stone Age, danger wasn't an occasional visitor, was a permanent roommate. For a cave woman, every day was lived under the shadow of something that could kill her before she even saw it coming. Wild animals, hostile humans, and the unforgiving elements all competed for the title of greatest threat. Predators were a constant concern. Large cats, like cave lions, could take down prey many times a human's size. Packs of wolves could stalk the tribe for days, waiting for a moment of weakness. Bears might wander too close to a food cache, and unlike modern bears, these prehistoric giants were far less shy about confrontation. The safest camp was one with a vigilant watch, and women often took turns keeping the fire going and scanning the darkness. The defense against predators wasn't always about fighting, it was about avoiding. Women developed a sharp awareness of animal tracks, scat, and even the silence of birds in the trees, using these cues to sense danger before it was visible. They knew when to pack up and move camp rather than risk an encounter. But animals weren't the only threat. Rival human groups could be even more dangerous. Competition over water sources, hunting grounds, and shelter sites could turn encounters deadly. Women played a key role in spotting distant figures on the horizon, recognizing friend from foe, and signaling to their own group whether to prepare for trade or for defense. Natural threats were just as lethal. Sudden storms could flood camps or wash away food supplies. Early frosts could wipe out entire foraging zones. Lightning strikes could ignite wildfires, forcing entire communities to flee in minutes. For women who often carried children or heavy supplies, these moments of crisis demanded quick decisions and physical endurance. Danger shaped every choice, every route, every plan. It wasn't paranoia, it was strategy. In the Stone Age, living cautiously didn't mean living in fear. It meant living long enough to see another sunrise, when danger couldn't be avoided. Cavewomen didn't simply stand behind the men and hope for protection, they had their own roles in defense, both physical and strategic. Weapons in the Stone Age weren't just for hunting. Women learned how to use digging sticks, stone knives, and even sharpened spears as deterrents against smaller predators. While a cave lion was beyond what a single human could fend off, coordinated noise, waving, fire, and throwing stones could scare off a threat before it closed in. In smaller skirmishes, such as with rival groups, women were sometimes on the front lines, not only to fight, but to protect resources and children. Defensive planning was constant. The placement of a camp wasn't random, it had to balance access to water and food with natural barriers against predators and enemies. Women contributed to site selection, pointing out choke points where a camp could be more easily defended, or areas where visibility made it easier to spot approaching danger. Early warning systems were primitive but effective. A ring of dry leaves or sticks around the camp could serve as a noise alarm if something approached. Fires were placed strategically, both for light and as deterrents to night hunters. Even the layout of sleeping arrangements was intentional, children in the center, adults on the outer edges, ready to respond. Women also played a major role in escape planning. If an attack came, they needed to know exactly where to run, which supplies to grab, and how to move the group quickly and quietly. Some tribes cached emergency food and tools in hidden spots, ensuring they wouldn't be left with nothing if the main camp was overrun. These tactics didn't come from theory, they were learned through hard experience. Every failure, every close call, was added to the group's survival playbook. And in this, cavewomen were not passive participants. They were living strategists, constantly balancing risk and reward in a world where hesitation could be fatal. Living with danger wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a mental marathon. For cavewomen, the constant need to anticipate threats shaped their thinking, their relationships, and even their parenting. Fear couldn't be allowed to paralyze. If you froze when a predator approached, you put everyone at risk. Women learned to channel fear into action, training themselves to respond instinctively, grabbing children, sounding alarms, or arming themselves without hesitation. This wasn't bravery in the modern, romantic sense. It was a survival reflex, honed by repetition. The psychological load was heavy. Every decision, whether to travel to a certain grove for berries, whether to risk a water source that showed signs of predators, carried the weight of knowing that a wrong choice could lead to death. In a sense, they lived in a constant state of crisis management, but without the luxury of ever turning it off. Yet, resilience grew out of this constant stress. Women built mental maps of safe zones, predator patterns, and seasonal changes in the environment. They became adept at reading subtle shifts in wind, weather, and animal behavior, skills that not only kept them alive, but gave them a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Community support was another layer of resilience. Stories told around the fire often served as cautionary tales, warning of dangerous plants, hostile tribes, or animal attacks. These narratives weren't just entertainment. They were collective survival lessons disguised as shared memory. Women drew strength from this knowledge pool, knowing they were part of a chain of experience stretching back generations. Even in the most dangerous moments, there was determination. Every successful avoidance of a predator, every safe return from a risky foraging trip reinforced the belief that survival was possible. That belief was essential. It kept people moving forward in a world where hesitation was deadly. In the Stone Age, resilience wasn't a luxury trait, it was as necessary as fire, water, or shelter. And for cavewomen, it was the invisible armor they wore every single day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the work didn't end, it simply changed shape. For a cavewoman, nightfall was a signal to shift from the labor of gathering and crafting to the equally vital tasks of protection, preparation, and connection. The first priority was the fire. Without it, the night belonged to predators. Women fed the flames with the last of the day's collected wood, arranging logs to burn slowly through the dark hours. A smoky fire kept insects away, while the light cast a protective halo around the camp. Maintaining it was an all-night job, one that women often shared in rotating shifts. Food preparation also carried into the evening. Fresh catches from the day had to be cooked or preserved before they spoiled. Roots were roasted in embers, meat was smoked or dried, and berries were sorted, some eaten immediately, others stored for leaner days. The smell of roasting food was both comforting and dangerous. It could draw animals closer, so vigilance never relaxed. Evening was also a time for mending and making. In the dim firelight, women worked hides, repaired baskets, and twisted fibers into cords. The tasks were repetitive but necessary tools, and clothing wore out quickly. And letting them fall into disrepair could be fatal when the next storm or cold snap hit. Yet night brought more than chores. It was the tribe's primary time for bonding and teaching. Children gathered close to hear stories, part entertainment, part survival manual. Women passed down knowledge through tales of ancestors, warnings about dangerous places, and myths that explained the natural world. These stories didn't just teach, they united the group in a shared identity. But rest was relative. Even after lying down, every rustle in the dark, every change in the wind kept the senses alert. Sleep came in light, fractured doses, always ready to break at the first sign of danger. In the Stone Age, the night was never fully managed. Once the essential chores were done and the fire burned steadily, The night became a stage for rituals and deeper social connection. For cave women, these moments weren't just free time, they were opportunities to strengthen the bonds that held the group together and to pass on the values that kept everyone alive. Some rituals were practical in origin but carried symbolic weight. Sharing food around the fire wasn't only about eating, it reinforced trust. Everyone could see that the day's resources were distributed fairly, which reduced resentment and built unity. In times of scarcity, this communal sharing was even more important, showing that the tribe's survival depended on cooperation, not competition. Other practices were spiritual. Women often played key roles in preparing or leading these rites, whether they involved chanting, drumming, or creating symbolic markings in the dirt with sticks or stones. These rituals could be tied to the hunt, the changing seasons, or honoring ancestors, all of which helped make sense of a harsh, unpredictable world. They were also morale boosters, a way of reminding the group that they were part of something bigger than their daily struggles. Storytelling took on a special weight after dark. The flicker of the fire cast dramatic shadows, making tales feel alive. Some stories were cautionary warnings about wandering too far from camp, or about plants that could kill. Others were aspirational, telling of clever escapes from predators or great journeys across dangerous lands. Women's voices carried these lessons forward, shaping the tribe's collective memory. Even small acts carried meaning. A mother braiding her daughter's hair by firelight might be passing down not just a style, but a technique for keeping hair neat and free of tangles during long days of labor. A grandmother might quietly demonstrate how to repair a tear in a hide while the rest of the group listened to a story. These nightly rituals weren't luxuries, they were survival tools, binding the group together in trust, shared knowledge, and a sense of purpose before the next day's challenges began. When the rituals ended and the last stories faded into the crackle of the fire, it was time for what passed as rest. But in the Stone Age, that word had a very different meaning. Sleep was rarely deep. Camps were rarely silent. The night carried its own sounds. The distant howl of wolves, the rustle of wind through leaves, the soft snap of a twig that could mean nothing, or something dangerous. Cave women often slept in short bursts, waking multiple times to feed the fire, check on children, or respond to sudden noises. Even sleeping arrangements were strategic. Families and trusted allies clustered together, with the most vulnerable infants, the sick, and elders in the center. Those on the perimeter acted as living shields, ready to be the first to respond if danger came from the darkness. Exhaustion was a constant companion. Day after day of physical labor, combined with fractured nights, wore down the body and mind. A tired gatherer could misidentify a poisonous plant. A weary watchkeeper might miss the faint glow of a predator's eyes in the dark. In the Stone Age, fatigue could be fatal. Yet, women found ways to adapt. They learned to grab moments of closing their eyes while tending the fire, leaning against a rock while grinding seeds, taking slow breaths to calm a racing heart. Older children often took on simple night duties so their mothers could sleep a little longer, an early form of communal caregiving that helped the group as a whole. And still, every morning began the same way. Before the sun had fully risen, the tasks of survival resumed. The day's work didn't care how tired you were. In this way, exhaustion wasn't just a condition, it was part of the environment, an ever-present factor in every decision a cave woman made. Rest in the Stone Age wasn't about recharging. It was about maintaining just enough strength to face the next 24 hours. And somehow, against the odds, they did again and again for generations.